Hey everyone, tonight we're drifting back to a humid, sun-baked corner of the 19th century world, to a small chain of volcanic islands quietly sitting between Java and Sumatra. Maybe you've heard of it, maybe your high school geography teacher mumbled it once between yawns, but tonight, it's just you, the sound of the sea, and the slow, inevitable rumbling of Krakatoa. So, get comfortable, dim the lights, let your mind float back to the 1880s, an age of telegrams, top hats, and way too much European confidence. Because what started as a normal tropical day in the Dutch East Indies would soon turn into one of the loudest, strangest, and most world-changing events in recorded history. But before we blow up the planet, literally, let's start, gently, with calm waves, and a bit of human arrogance. In 1883, the island of Krakatoa was part of the Dutch colonial empire. It sat quietly in the Sunda Strait, a narrow stretch of ocean between the two massive Indonesian islands of Java and Sumatra. It wasn't exactly a tourist spot, just a small jungle-covered volcano sitting in the sea, occasionally sending up little puffs of smoke, the geological equivalent of a bored sigh. The people who lived nearby were mostly fishermen, traders, and villagers. They'd seen the island smoke before. It was no big deal. Volcanoes were part of life here, like monsoon rains or colonial taxes. They rumbled, they steamed, they made people nervous, then nothing happened. Usually, the Dutch, of course, had other things on their mind. Running a colonial empire isn't easy, especially when most of your workers hate you and your coffee plantations keep catching diseases. By the 1880s, the Dutch East Indies was a bureaucratic maze of paperwork and self-importance, run by pale men in linen suits who sweated constantly and wrote reports about native disturbances. Somewhere in that mess of colonial paperwork was a record, a small volcanic eruption noted near Krakatoa. Nothing alarming, just an observation. Because of course, what's a little fire in the distance compared to the glorious work of empire building? Still, the locals knew something felt off. In May 1883, small explosions began to rattle the ground. A fine dust volcanic ash started falling like grey snow. Ships passing through the strait reported hearing dull booms echoing across the water. But this wasn't the first time Krakatoa had made noise. There had been eruptions centuries earlier. It was part of a family of volcanoes that liked attention. People shrugged. The earth shakes sometimes. What can you do? Meanwhile, Dutch scientists stationed nearby started doing what scientists always do when nature acts up. They took notes, made sketches, and probably debated over tea whether they were witnessing something significant. One of them even wrote, rather calmly, that some activity has resumed on the island. Understatement of the century. The real story, though, wasn't just geological. It was global, because the late 19th century was obsessed with measuring things. Barometers, telescopes, telegrams. It was the golden age of data. For the first time in history, when something massive happened in one corner of the world, the news could spread fast, which meant that when Krakatoa finally lost its temper, people wouldn't just hear about it months later through travelers' tales. They'd feel it almost immediately. Let's pause here for a second. Imagine the world in 1883. No airplanes, no satellites, no warning systems. Just a lot of humans, scattered across the globe, quietly living their lives under the same fragile layer of atmosphere. Farmers ploughing fields in Europe, sailors on the Indian Ocean, Victorian families reading by lamplight. Nobody realizing that a tiny island on the far side of the world was about to cough up more energy than a nuclear arsenal. And when it did, when that explosion came, it would shatter eardrums hundreds of miles away. It would send tsunamis racing across oceans. It would literally change the color of the sky. But for now, it was still calm. Birds chirped in the forests of Java. Waves lapped against the black sand. And deep inside Krakatoa, magma was quietly rising, building pressure, looking for a way out. You could say this was the planet taking a deep breath before a scream. Back in Batavia, modern-day Jakarta, life went on as usual. Dutch officials complained about humidity. Traders loaded ships with spices, tin, and coffee. Nobody realized that Krakatoa had already entered the final stage of its build-up. The first real sign came in late May. A Dutch captain sailing through the Sunda Strait saw a column of smoke rising from the island to 7 miles high. That's not your average puff of steam. That's the atmosphere saying, something big's coming. Within days, ash was falling on ships. Lightning crackled inside volcanic clouds. and the nights began to glow faintly red, the eerie kind of light that makes people whisper and stare at the horizon. Still, colonial newspapers brushed it off. A volcanic disturbance of some magnitude, one wrote, which is the kind of phrase you use when you read too polite to say, we might all die. The scientists, on the other hand, were thrilled. Finally, something interesting. They set up observation posts, took barometer readings, and argued about which vent was the primary source of emission, because nothing says European academic energy like standing next to a volcano with a notebook and zero self-preservation instinct. Let's float over now to a small Javanese village at dusk. People are finishing their evening prayers. Kids are chasing chickens. The air smells faintly of sulfur. Out at sea, fishermen see distant flashes, silent for a few seconds, then followed by a dull, rolling boom, the kind that rattles your ribs. By June, the explosions were regular. Columns of ash shot miles into the sky. The island seemed to breathe, expanding, contracting, hissing. New vents opened up, spitting fire. The sea around Krakatoa began to boil. But humans are good at ignoring slow disasters. Ships still passed through the strait. Trade continued. People adapted, because that's what people do, even when the ground literally warns them to leave. And so, as the summer of 1883 rolled on, Krakatoa kept rising to a climax, a slow crescendo, week after week. The Dutch wrote their little reports. The locals watched the sky change color. And the earth, well, it just waited. In the next part, we'll drift into August, the month when the noise became unbearable, when the sea turned black, and when the entire planet felt a single volcanic heartbeat. Hey, again, still awake? Good tonight. We're heading right into August 1883, the month when Krakatoa decided to remind humanity who's really in charge. The sky is about to turn grey, the air is about to shake, and the world, quite literally, is about to go dark. It started quietly, almost politely. Early August brought more explosions, more ash, and the kind of background thunder people tried to ignore. Ships passing through the Sunda Strait began reporting seas choked with floating pumice, little grey stones that hissed and bumped against their hulls like ghostly pebbles. A few captains, perhaps smarter than average, decided to steer clear. Others, being 19th century men full of confidence and sideburns, carried on. By the third week of August, Krakatoa had turned into a monster orchestra. Multiple vents were erupting at once, blasting columns of steam and ash miles into the sky. The sea near the island shimmered with heat, and anyone within 50 miles could feel the constant vibration underfoot, like the earth itself had developed a pulse. Still, the Dutch authorities were calm, or at least pretending to be. They sent observers. They took notes. They filed neat little reports that began with words like moderate activity, continues, because nothing says colonial denial like pretending a planet-sized explosion is just a local inconvenience. Then came August 26th. That morning, the first massive detonation ripped through the strait. It was so loud that people in Batavia, over 80 miles away, heard it clearly and thought a ship's powder magazine had exploded. Windows rattled. Dogs howled. The air went still for a moment, as if the wind itself forgot what it was supposed to do. By noon, the sun had vanished behind thick ash. The world turned an eerie, copper color. Ships that had been sailing toward Krakatoa found themselves in near-total darkness by mid-afternoon. Lightning danced through the clouds. Sulfur filled the air. And then, just before midnight, another explosion, even larger. The sound rolled across the ocean, a low, unending roar. But the real show, the one that would rewrite global weather and history books, was waiting for dawn. August 27, 1883. At exactly 10:02 a.m., the island of Krakatoa tore itself apart. The explosion was so loud it was heard nearly 3,000 miles away, as far as Australia and even parts of India. It wasn't just noise, it was pressure. Sound waves that circled the planet multiple times, recorded on barometers everywhere from London to New York. To put it simply, this wasn't an eruption. It was a planet screaming. A British ship, the Norham Castle, was anchored about 40 miles away. The captain wrote later. The ear-splitting reports continued. My eardrums were shattered. The sound was so powerful that sailors on other ships were knocked off their feet. One described the sensation as being hit by the air itself. Then came the tsunamis. When Krakatoa's main cone collapsed into the sea, It displaced an unimaginable volume of water. Waves up to 120 feet high slammed into the nearby coastlines. The entire villages along Java and Sumatra were erased in minutes. Official colonial reports, the ones that survived, estimated over 36,000 deaths, though modern scientists think it might have been more than 100,000. There were stories of ships being found miles inland, carried by waves that rolled through river valleys. Some survivors described the ocean as boiling. Others said the air itself was on fire. And yet, somehow, this was only part of the story. Because Krakatoa didn't just destroy, it changed the atmosphere. Ash and sulfur shot 50 miles into the sky, reaching the stratosphere. There, the particles spread across the globe, reflecting sunlight and painting sunsets red for years. Victorian poets thought the world was ending. Painters in Europe couldn't believe their eyes. Skies glowed crimson long after dusk. Edvard Munch, years later, said his famous painting The Scream was inspired by the eerie red twilight caused by Krakatoa's dust. The world, quite literally, was living under the shadow of a volcano. For months afterward, temperatures dropped worldwide. The summer of 1884 was colder than usual. Crops failed in parts of North America and Europe. Scientists called it a volcanic winter, all because one island decided it had had enough of existing. The British, being the British, installed new barometers and telegram systems to record the aftershocks. The Dutch built more observation posts, and the locals, well, they rebuilt. Because what else can you do when the earth itself falls apart under your feet? Let's pause for a moment though, and think about what it must have felt like to live through that week. Imagine standing on the coast of Java, the sky pitch black at noon, lightning zigzagging through ash clouds, the sea sucking backward before returning as a wall of water, every sound muffled by falling ash, every breath filled with grit, and the only thing louder than the explosions was the silence that came afterward. It's the kind of silence the world never forgets. In the months that followed, the Dutch East Indies tried to return to normal, but normal had changed. Where Krakatoa once stood was now a vast, underwater caldera, a crater 3 miles wide. The island was gone, obliterated. For decades, ships navigated carefully through the strait, passing the site like people whispering near a grave. But nature has a habit of rebuilding too, and deep below that watery crater, magma was already stirring again, planning its comeback. Let's drift there in the next part. We'll see what the world looked like after the dust settled, literally, how scientists tried to make sense of it all, how myths grew, and how Krakatoa quietly began to rise from the sea once more. Welcome back. Tonight, we're refloating through the quiet aftermath, the strange calm that followed the loudest sound ever heard by human ears. Krakatoa was gone, the sea still hissed with heat, and the world above it had gone grey. For most people alive in late 1883, the eruption wasn't just an event, it was a question: what just happened to the sky? The Dutch East Indies looked like a war zone. For weeks after the explosions, ash fell like snow over hundreds of miles. The air smelled of sulfur and death. Palm trees were snapped in half. The ocean was filled with the debris of villages, boats, bamboo, pieces of roofs. In Batavia, the colonial capital, a reddish haze hung over the harbor for days. Ships sat coated in fine grey dust. And though the eruption was over, the world itself still seemed to tremble. The colonial government, in classic 19th century fashion, tried to document the disaster before actually helping people. They sent surveyors to count the dead, scientists to take samples, and photographers to capture evidence of the event. Nothing says empire like turning catastrophe into paperwork. One of the earliest photographers on the scene, a Dutchman named Isidor van Kittensbergen, took haunting images of the coastline. Entire forests flattened, coastlines erased, the sea stained a dull brown. You could still see half-buried boats miles inland, like toys tossed by a careless child. And then there were the sounds. People described faint booms echoing from the strait for weeks afterward. Not explosions, exactly, but something deeper, the kind of sound that lives in your bones. Scientists later called it secondary eruptions, but for the locals, it felt like the earth still whispering its anger. But the strangest part wasn't in Indonesia. It was everywhere else, all around the world. The sky began to behave oddly. In London, by the winter of 1883, sunsets looked like fire. The poet, Gerard Manley Hopkins, called them blood sunsets. The painter William Ashcroft made sketch after sketch of the sky glowing crimson, long after the sun went down. Newspapers in America and Europe ran articles about weird lights in the heavens. Nobody quite understood why, until scientists connected the dots. It turned out that the dust and sulfur from Krakatoa had reached the upper atmosphere, forming a thin global veil that scattered sunlight. This was the first time in history humans actually tracked a planetary-scale event from one side of the Earth to the other. Telegraph operators even recorded strange fluctuations in air pressure, the literal shockwave of the eruption traveling around the world multiple times. Imagine that, the barometer on your desk in London, twitching because an island you've never heard of just exploded on the other side of the world. Meanwhile, back in Java and Sumatra, the survivors tried to rebuild villages that had been swept away by tsunamis were slowly reoccupied. The Dutch, somewhat late to the empathy party, began organizing relief ships. Missionaries handed out food and tracts about divine punishment. Everyone had their own explanation: divine anger, the end of the world, bad spirits. Science hadn't yet figured out how to compete with theology in explaining global darkness. Even as new crops were planted and new huts went up, the landscape was unrecognizable. Where the old Krakatoa island had been, there was now only open water, a gaping, steaming crater that hissed and bubbled like a cauldron. But that wasn't the end of the story, because in the years that followed, something remarkable happened. Beneath the waves, the same geological forces that had destroyed Krakatoa began to rebuild it. By 1927, small eruptions started breaking the surface again, forming a new island. The locals called it Anak Krakatau, the child of Krakatoa. It was smaller, quieter, and frankly, better behaved, though every now and then, it still reminded everyone who its parent was. Even today, that little island still grows a bit each year, puffing away like a restless ghost of the original. Scientists monitor it closely because, well, they've seen the family history. But let's zoom back to the 1880s one last time. Because beyond the ash and the science, Krakatoa had a strange psychological effect on the world. In Europe, people became obsessed with volcanoes. Scientific societies popped up everywhere. Victorian dinner parties featured Krakatoa talk like it was the latest celebrity scandal. The sky turned green over Paris. One man claimed, another insisted his chickens stopped laying eggs for a month. Possibly the least tragic Krakatoa side effect ever recorded. And in a more serious sense, the eruption changed how humanity understood the planet. For the first time, scientists realized that a single event could alter global climate. The 1883 Krakatoa eruption helped lay the groundwork for modern atmospheric science, long before words like climate change or global warming existed. The art world, too, felt its tremors. Painters captured the eerie light, the smudged sunsets. Writers used it as a symbol, nature's indifference to human ambition. And Edvard Munch, decades later, remembered seeing a blood-red sky over Norway after Krakatoa. He said it made him feel a great unending scream passing through nature. That feeling became the foundation for his painting The Scream, one of the most famous images of human anxiety ever made. So, in a way, Krakatoa's legacy isn't just geological, it's emotional. The world's anxiety painted across the sky in red dust. As for the Dutch, they rebuilt their observation posts, wrote thorough, painfully bureaucratic reports, gave lectures in The Hague about seismic disturbances, and eventually, the memory of Krakatoa faded until Anak Krakatau started grumbling again in the 20th century, reminding everyone that volcanoes don't care about calendars. By the late 1880s, life in Java and Sumatra had settled back into rhythm. Crops grew again, trade returned, the skies cleared. But there was one thing no one could forget, that for a few days in 1883, the sun itself disappeared. People still talked about it decades later. The week the day turned to night, when the air went silent, when the earth itself roared loud enough to be heard half a world away. And if you think about it, that's kind of comforting in a strange way, because it reminds us that we're reliving on a planet that est very much alive, unpredictable, moody, and sometimes loud. Krakatoa may have gone quiet, but it left us with something to remember. A world connected by one sound, a sky painted by one explosion, and a planet that, every once in a while, clears its throat just to remind us who's boss. So, close your eyes, imagine that distant rumble under the waves, the slow pulse of magma far below your feet, the air warm and heavy, the sky beginning to darken again, because somewhere out there, Anak Krakatau is still breathing. let's ease into the final stretch. The explosions have faded, the ash has settled, and the world has moved on. But Krakatoa's story didn't end with silence. It left echoes that still reach us today. So, tonight, we're floating forward, through the decades that followed, watching how one volcano quietly reshaped the way humans saw the planet beneath their feet. After 1883, the Dutch East Indies became a living laboratory. Scientists from Europe arrived in droves, armed with brass instruments, thermometers, and an unshakable belief that they could measure anything, even chaos. They studied everything: air temperature, water chemistry, magnetic fluctuations, even the color of the sunsets. It was the birth of global science in a very literal sense. For the first time, people realized that an event in one corner of the world could ripple through the entire atmosphere. In a century obsessed with industry, progress, and empire, Krakatoa had done what no politician could. It connected the world through nature. The telegraph cables that stretched across oceans carried news of the eruption within hours. Scientists compared readings across continents. The word global started to mean something different, less about maps and power, more about shared vulnerability. And the skies kept their strange glow for a long time. Through 1884 and into 1886, twilight looked uncanny almost everywhere. The sunsets had a layered, metallic quality, with purples melting into golds and reds. People described them as beautiful, unsettling, and somehow holy. In London, crowds gathered on bridges to watch the light fade. In New York, church sermons tried to explain the colors as divine signs. And all the while, the dust from Krakatoa drifted gently above their heads, circling the world again and again. It's easy to forget how small the Earth really is, until one mountain reminds us. By the early 20th century, the name Krakatoa had become legend. Children learned about it in geography lessons. Newspapers mentioned it whenever another volcano erupted. And in 1927, when the first eruptions of Anak Krakatau broke the surface, it felt almost poetic, like the Earth telling a sequel no one had asked for, but everyone expected. The new island started as a grey lump of rock and ash. Every few years, it grew a little taller. Sometimes it exploded mildly, sending small plumes of smoke skyward. Sometimes it slept. Today, it stands about 300 meters high, still young, still restless, and every time it stirs, seismologists turn their instruments toward the Sunder Strait, just to be sure the old beast isn't waking up again. What makes Krakatoa's story so haunting is how it blurs the line between human and natural time. Empires rise and fall in centuries. Volcanoes think in millennia. To Krakatoa, the 1883 eruption was probably just a bad day, a vent clearing. To us, it was apocalypse. And yet, it's also a story of resilience. Life returned. Forests regrew on the nearby islands. Birds, insects, and lizards recolonized the barren land, carried by wind and sea. Within 50 years, scientists recorded dense vegetation and hundreds of species thriving again. The planet healed itself while humans were still arguing about who to blame. Culturally, Krakatoa never really left. Books romanticized it. Movies dramatized it. Even early radio programs retold the story as if it were a parable about hubris. But the real lesson wasn't moral, it was environmental. Krakatoa forced humanity to confront a truth that's easy to forget. We don't live on the Earth, we live with it. Every storm, every tremor, every glowing sunset is part of the same restless system. And the next time you see the sky go red at dusk, there's a tiny chance, just a sliver, that some of that light is bending through ash from a volcano far away, still doing what volcanoes do, reshaping the world quietly without asking permission. Fast forward to now, the Sunder Strait is still watched closely by satellites and seismic monitors. Anak Krakatau still grumbles. In 2018, it partially collapsed, sending another deadly tsunami toward the coasts of Java and Sumatra. It was smaller, but eerily familiar, a reminder that history isn't linear. It loops. And yet, despite our technology, despite satellites that can see in real time, that same helpless awe remains. Even today, when a volcano erupts, we still stop and stare, the same way people did in 1883. So, what did Krakatoa really change? It didn't end the world, but it shifted our sense of it. It taught us that the planet breathes, that its moods ripple through every corner of the sky, that human civilization is a very temporary tenant on a living, moving crust. The explosions, shockwaves circled the globe 7 times. Its sound was heard farther than any other in history, but its quiet aftermath may have been the more profound echo, a world suddenly aware of its fragility. And that's where we'll leave it tonight. Not in fear, but in calm. Because if there's a beauty in disaster, it's that it reminds us to look up. At the sky, at the light, at the tiny signs of a living Earth that's been around a lot longer than us, and will be here long after we're gone. So, take a breath. The air above you has traveled across oceans, through storms, maybe even through the faint trace of volcanic dust. The planet hums beneath your feet, steady and ancient. Krakatoa sleeps again. For now, we've drifted all the way from the calm seas of 1883, through the chaos, the darkness, and back again to silence. The waves have stilled, the air's cooled, and the story of Krakatoa is finally quiet. It's strange, isn't it? How something that destroyed so much ended up giving the world a lesson in connection, not just through science, but through feeling. Everyone on Earth saw the same red sky. Everyone, from Java to London, looked up and wondered what was happening. For a brief moment, the whole planet shared one story. And maybe that's why this tale lingers. It's not just about a volcano. It's about perspective. About how tiny we are under the same fragile layer of sky. About how easily the ground can change beneath us, and how easily life finds a way back afterward. Even the island came back. The child of Krakatoa rose quietly from the sea, as if the earth itself couldn't let the story end. It still breathes out smoke now and then, a reminder that nothing in nature really dies. It just transforms. So tonight, as the world outside your window settles into its own silence, remember that beneath everything, beneath every city, every ocean, every step, the earth is still alive, turning and sighing softly, the same way it did long before us. Thanks for drifting through history tonight. Rest easy, and let the rumble fade. The fire's gone. The sky is calm again, and for now at least, Krakatoa sleeps.